Most people think what just happened in Venezuela is about Maduro. It's not. It never was. What the world just witnessed wasn't a sanctions enforcement operation or a naval blockade in the traditional sense. It was the deliberate weaponization of uncertainty, a precision strike on global energy flows designed to hit a target 8,000 miles away from Caracas. And that target is Beijing. Here's what everyone missed. When the United States tightened its grip on Venezuelan waters, it didn't need to intercept every tanker. It only needed to create hesitation. And hesitation in global shipping is a weapon more powerful than any missile, because oil doesn't move simply because it exists. It moves because insurers underwrite risk, because ports guarantee access, because schedules are predictable, and because delays are manageable. Remove any one of those pillars, and the system begins to seize. Remove several at once, and it collapses entirely. Shipping operates on razor-thin margins. A single day of delay for a large crude carrier costs tens of thousands of dollars. Multiply that across inspections, insurance rate spikes, and rerouting, and suddenly carrying Venezuelan crude becomes economically irrational. This is the invisible pressure. Ships turn away before they're ever stopped. Traders cancel contracts before penalties are discussed. Insurers quietly withdraw coverage or raise premiums to levels that make transactions unprofitable. What looks like a blockade on paper becomes something far more effective in practice, a market-wide refusal to engage, and the consequences didn't stay in Venezuela. Every barrel that failed to leave Caracas was a barrel that failed to reach a Chinese refinery. For years, China had been quietly absorbing Venezuelan crude at massive discounts, sometimes 30–40% below market rates. This wasn't charity, it was strategy. Cheap energy is oxygen for a manufacturing economy. Chinese refiners are built around predictable flows and carefully managed margins. Venezuelan oil, sold at steep reductions due to sanctions and isolation, had become an integral input. When those shipments slowed or stopped, it wasn't merely an inconvenience, it was a disruption to cost structures, supply forecasts, and energy security calculations. This is where the story fundamentally shifts. Because what looks like an oil crisis is actually the opening move in a financial war. Beijing didn't see a regional enforcement action. It saw a demonstration of American reach, a reminder that if oil moves by sea, it moves under U.S. oversight. And that realization changes everything. China can't respond ship for ship. It knows the U.S. Navy controls the critical choke points that feed its economy, the Strait of Hormuz, the Suez Canal, the Malacca Strait. Attempting to match that projection would be slow, expensive, and escalatory. Building fleets takes decades. Securing alternate routes requires infrastructure that doesn't yet exist. So Beijing does what it does best. It finds asymmetry, and the asymmetry it found is currency. While the world watched tankers hesitate and production fall, China quietly began allowing its currency to strengthen. Not dramatically, not with emergency announcements or panicked revaluations, just steady, deliberate policy signals that told markets one thing: we're willing to sacrifice export competitiveness for strategic leverage. This is a profound shift. For years, Beijing carefully managed the yuan to support exports, absorbing international criticism about currency manipulation, but the context has changed. When the United States applies pressure through energy supply chains, the cost-benefit analysis shifts. Cheap exports matter less when access itself is threatened. A stronger yuan does several things simultaneously. First, it makes Chinese assets more attractive to global investors. Capital flows toward yield and stability. When foreign money sees a currency backed by a state willing to defend it, and an economy absorbing inflows, it responds. Second, it increases Beijing's purchasing power abroad. Gold, commodities, infrastructure, strategic acquisitions, everything becomes cheaper when your currency buys more. Third, and most critically, it pressures the dollar at exactly the moment Washington needs capital inflows to finance its expanding deficits. Here's the brutal calculus that most analysts refuse to acknowledge. Maintaining global naval dominance is astronomically expensive. Every patrol, every deployment, every extended blockade feeds into a fiscal structure already buckling under $36 trillion in debt. The U.S. must borrow to project power. But borrowing requires higher yields to attract capital. Higher yields bring in money, but they also deepen the deficit by increasing interest costs. It's a feedback loop. You spend more to maintain control. That spending requires more borrowing. More borrowing requires higher rates. Higher rates increase the burden, and China just started exploiting it. This is why the Venezuelan oil squeeze was a strategic miscalculation. Washington assumed the pain would remain localized. A sanctioned regime under pressure, regional instability contained, allies reassured. It didn't account for how Beijing would interpret the move. not as punishment for Maduro, but as a warning shot across China's economic bow, a signal that critical supply lines can be threatened at will. And once that interpretation is made, the response becomes structural, not reactive. China doesn't need the dollar to collapse overnight. It doesn't need a dramatic crisis or a sudden flight from U.S. assets. It only needs marginal shifts. A few percentage points of global reserves reallocated from dollars to yuan or gold, a gradual increase in bilateral trade settled in alternative currencies, a steady rise in foreign participation in Chinese bond markets. Each of these chips away at the network effects that make U.S. sanctions so effective in the first place. Because sanctions work when there's no alternative. When options multiply, pressure loses potency. The irony is impossible to ignore. By demonstrating how easily energy flows can be disrupted, the U.S. inadvertently accelerated the very process it fears most, the erosion of dollar dominance. Because when you weaponize access to oil, you remind the world that access itself is conditional, and conditional access breeds alternatives. Countries start asking uncomfortable questions. If Washington can choke off Venezuelan oil today, what about Middle Eastern oil tomorrow? If supply chains can be weaponized during peacetime, what happens during actual conflict? This is where Venezuela stops being the story and becomes a symptom. The real contest is over which system the world trusts when pressure mounts. And trust in finance is everything. It's built slowly through consistency and credibility. But it can erode quickly when actions reveal costs that were previously hidden. Currency wars don't start with declarations. They don't begin with emergency meetings or dramatic policy reversals. They start with quiet recalibrations, yield differentials, exchange rate expectations, portfolio adjustments made by pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and institutional investors who manage trillions in capital. And once that capital begins to move, momentum takes over. Because money is opportunistic, it flows toward stability, yield, and reduced risk. When the calculus shifts even slightly, behavior changes. And when behavior changes at scale, systems shift. What's unfolding now isn't visible like a blockade. There are no tankers stuck at sea, no dramatic seizures broadcast on cable news. Instead, there's a slow, methodical repricing of risk across global markets. Investors who once treated dollar-denominated assets as the unquestioned default are now confronted with a shifting calculation. Chinese markets have been outperforming. The yuan is firming against expectations. Gold accumulation by central banks is accelerating at the fastest pace in decades. These aren't isolated events. They're signals, and the market is starting to read them. Here's the part that should terrify policymakers in Washington. This is just the beginning. The oil disruption was the spark. The currency response is the fire. And once financial architecture starts shifting, it doesn't reverse easily. Because unlike ships which can be rerouted, or blockades which can be lifted, once confidence begins to erode and capital begins to diversify, the process acquires its own gravity. Small moves compound. A country diversifies 5% of its reserves away from dollars. That's manageable, but when 10 countries do it, then 20, the pressure multiplies. Marginal shifts accumulate. Trade agreements begin incorporating currency swap lines. Bilateral deals are settled outside the dollar system. Energy contracts are denominated in alternative currencies. None of this happens overnight, but the direction becomes unmistakable. And what looked like strength, the ability to choke off oil flows at will, to enforce sanctions across oceans, to project naval power globally, reveals itself as vulnerability. Because every action taken to assert control exposes the cost of maintaining it. The U.S. Navy isn't free, global enforcement isn't cheap. The infrastructure required to monitor shipping lanes, inspect vessels, and maintain presence across multiple theaters requires constant investment. And that investment is funded through debt that must be serviced, debt that requires foreign buyers, debt that becomes harder to sell when confidence wavers. The Venezuelan episode, therefore, wasn't about oil. It was about leverage. And in trying to demonstrate dominance, the United States may have just accelerated the transition to a world where that dominance costs more than it's worth. Because the countries being pressured are learning. They're watching how enforcement works. They're identifying the mechanisms, and they're building alternatives. The battlefield has moved. It's no longer defined by sea lanes and tankers and naval deployments. It's defined by balance sheets, reserve currencies, and the quiet decisions made by investors, central banks, and sovereign wealth funds across the globe. These institutions don't need to coordinate. They don't need a conspiracy. They just need to follow incentives. And right now, the incentives are shifting. This is the currency war that was always coming. Venezuela just made it impossible to ignore. For years, analysts warned that weaponizing the financial system would eventually provoke a response, that overuse of sanctions would drive countries toward alternatives, that leveraging the dollar's dominance too aggressively would erode the trust that makes that dominance possible. Those warnings were dismissed as theoretical. They're not theoretical anymore. The question now isn't whether this conflict will escalate. It's whether anyone is prepared for what escalation in the financial domain actually looks like. Because unlike conventional wars, which have clear battlefields and defined combatants, currency wars are diffuse. They unfold across thousands of transactions, millions of decisions, and trillions in capital flows. There's no single moment of crisis. Instead, there's a gradual realization that the rules have changed, that the old assumptions no longer hold, that the system itself is being rewired in real time. And here's what makes this moment so dangerous. Both sides believe they're operating from positions of strength. Washington believes its control over global logistics and its unmatched military reach provide decisive leverage. Beijing believes its manufacturing dominance, reserve accumulation, and patient capital give it staying power. Both are partially right. Both are also missing the larger picture. The larger picture is that systems under stress don't fail predictably. They fail suddenly, often in ways no one anticipated. The 2008 financial crisis wasn't caused by a single bad loan. It was caused by interconnected vulnerabilities that compounded until the structure collapsed. The same dynamic is at play now, but on a geopolitical scale. Energy dependencies, currency regimes, fiscal pressures, and military commitments are all interlinked. Pull on one thread and the tension spreads. What started as an enforcement action in Venezuelan waters has now set in motion a chain reaction that neither side can fully control. China's currency response pressures U.S. bond markets. Pressure on bond markets forces higher yields. Higher yields strain the domestic economy and complicate Fed policy. Complicated Fed policy creates market volatility. Volatility spooks investors. Spooked investors seek safety. And if dollar assets no longer represent unambiguous safety, capital finds alternatives. This feedback loop is already in motion. It's not moving fast enough to trigger panic, but it's moving steadily enough to be irreversible without significant policy shifts, and those shifts would require sacrifices neither side is currently willing to make. The U.S. would need to reduce its global enforcement footprint, accept diminished leverage, and tolerate alternative power centers. China would need to open its capital markets more fully, accept currency volatility, and risk destabilizing inflows. Neither seems likely. So the escalation continues, not through dramatic confrontations, but through incremental adjustments that accumulate into structural change. The oil war was just the prelude. The real war is happening in markets, in the quiet decisions of asset managers and central bankers, in the slow drift of capital away from one system and toward another, and it's already begun. The final irony is this. The very tools that made American power unchallengeable for decades, control of sea lanes, dominance of the dollar, ability to enforce sanctions globally, are now accelerating the emergence of the multipolar world Washington sought to prevent. Because power, when exercised without restraint, eventually teaches others how to resist it, and resistance in the 21st century doesn't require matching force with force. It requires patience, capital, and the willingness to let your opponent's costs compound while you build alternatives. Venezuela's oil was never the prize, it was the trigger. The prize is the future architecture of global finance, and that contest is just getting started.